Welcome to our seminar session for December. My name is Devin Crawford. I am the Center Administrator here at the Rural Drug Addiction Research Center, which we call the RDAR Center here at Nebraska. It is truly my pleasure to introduce to you all today Kathie Starkweather. Kathie has spent most of her career working in rural communities across the country on various social justice issues. As a rural sociologist for USDA, she researched and developed training on non-conscious bias, and that's what she's going to be talking with us about today. She moved from the federal government to the nonprofit world, and she first worked as an organizer and then directed the Food and Farm program at the Center for Rural Affairs. In that capacity, she continued her work in social justice, developing programs around food justice, inclusive small towns, the environment, and beginning women and Latino farmers. She retired from the Center for Rural Affairs in May. That's a mouthful. And she began working part-time for the RDAR Center, assisting us with in-person data collection and project coordination. She has 2 daughters and 4 grandkiddos. So we are very happy to have you all here to join us and to have Kathie present today. So thank you so much. I'm gonna go off video, Kathie, so people can focus on you and the presentation, but if you need anything, let us know, or Callie and I can jump back on. So thanks so much.
Thanks, Devin. And good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining. Thank you, Devin, for that introduction. I did want to mention that if you have any questions during this presentation at any point, feel free to do the little hand raise, and Callie is watching that, and she will unmute you so you can ask a question. So if you don't feel like you want to ask a question, that's fine too, but you do have that option. I'm going to talk to you today about implicit bias or non-conscious bias or non-conscious discrimination. Those are all, that's all language that is used. What I'm planning on doing is sharing information with you about things that I have learned, things that I have researched, essentially how the cognitive process works and how that essentially makes implicit bias our norm for human beings. And then at the end, toward the end, then I am going to share some ideas about some interventions that might work, at least to help minimize implicit bias. We all have implicit biases, even if we intend really hard to not use them. They still affect our judgment. They affect our decision-making. And if you think about the impacts that can have, it impacts our behavior, it impacts other people's behaviors, it affects how we hire, how we fire, who we hire, who we fire, who our friends are, and on and on. And it's something that we are not aware that we're doing. Before I get into the presentation as a whole, though, I kind of want to set the stage, if you don't mind, and take a few minutes to kind of present a scenario that I'm going to refer back to over and over again, actually. So imagine, and you can certainly close your eyes if you want to really get in the mood, but imagine, if you will, that it's Friday of a week from hell, and you are tired and you don't want to see another human being until Monday morning, frankly. But in order to reach that very lofty goal, you have to stop at the grocery store and pick up a few items. So you go to the grocery store, you pick up your couple of items and head toward the lane that's 10 items or less. And in front of you, because you are, remember, you're heightenedly crabby, and in front of you is a woman, and in her grocery cart, she has, dare I say it, 13 items. And you are really honing in on those items to figure out what she's purchasing. So she has things like frozen shrimp or and cookies, maybe chips, frozen pizza, maybe some juice. And a few years ago, she could have tossed in some cigarettes. And this is what she looks like. She looks a bit disheveled. Her hair is kind of stringy and greasy and messy. She has an really oversized t-shirt on that has several stains on it, maybe cigarette burns, some big baggy sweatpants, maybe a pair of flip-flops. And with her, she has her 3 children, and they appear very much like she does, disheveled and, hair kind of stringy and stuff. And they're fighting with each other, and they're fighting with her, and they're pushing and shoving, and it's really uncomfortable for you. When she gets up to make payment for those groceries, how do you think she's going to pay for those groceries? If anybody wants to raise a hand, we can call on you. Otherwise, generally speaking, if somebody wanted to say something, no?
It looks like, sorry, I'm kind of talking invisibly here, Kathy. It looks like Claire St. Peter said with a check written by hand in the chat.
Oh, well, that's a very good one. I had not thought of that. Generally, what people will respond is their expectation is that she will pay with SNAP or food stamps based on her appearance, based on the fact that she's a woman, and based on a few other things. And so thank you for that, Claire. If we're back in that grocery store, then Friday night, it's the same situation that you've had this week. And in front of you in the checkout line of the 10 items or less is a well-dressed white male who has a coat and a tie on. And he's got two well-dressed children with him. And they're all getting along very well. And in his grocery cart, he's got exactly the same things that the woman does, who I just talked about. Are there how many of you think that he would pay with SNAP or with food stamps? Try to turn this. Okay. Well, our assumption, the general assumption, having given this presentation 1.5 million times, I exaggerate, but generally people do not expect that. And if he had in fact paid with SNAP, most likely, more likely than not, we wouldn't even have noticed it. And these are examples of non-conscious or implicit bias. We make decisions based on the kinds of things that we have squirreled away in our mind, which I'll go much more into in a little bit. So remember this little story because I'm going to refer back to it several times if you don't mind. Okay, I think we need to revisit what explicit or blatant discrimination is, and we know what that is. We've seen years and years of it, read about it, learned about it. Segregation, women being denied the right to vote, housing discrimination, wage discrimination, and on and on. But it is intentional compared to implicit bias, which is unintentional. And the intentionality of it has created laws and policies that have been put into place that are supposed to keep it from happening. We know that isn't always the case, but it's those laws are in place. When we look at implicit bias or non-conscious discrimination, it's much different. It's that second half of the iceberg that we don't see, and it's something that people don't recognize that they have themselves. And people will tell you over and over, I am not racist. But we're very unaware when we do it. It's an automatic response. It's an immediate response, and we apply it liberally in everything that we do. We apply it in ways like microaggressions, and those are something I think most of us know about, but it's, making a comment like, well, you're really pretty for an African-American girl, or touching somebody's hair because it's different than yours, or it impacts how we hire. And there's also something called the look that people of color are unfortunately probably used to, but I'm just going to play this really brief video to kind of give you a sense of what that is, in case you haven't experienced it. And maybe by seeing this, you can get a sense of how it feels to experience it.
Kathie, this is Devin. I don't think the video is working for us on our end.
Oh, it's not working for you all?
You might have to do another screen share of the video, and there's an option to share the audio, or I don't know, Callie, if you might be able to pull up that link on your end and share it from your end.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm actually going to type it in now, if that's okay, Kathy.
And then, yeah, Kathie, you don't have to lose your spot or anything in the presentation.
Okay.
Yeah, of course. I'll pull it up real fast, and then I'll share my screen, and I'll switch it back to you here. So.
Thanks, Callie. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Callie.
Give me just a second. All righty here. Gonna stop Kathie's screen share. Gonna fix mine here. All righty. Kathie, Devin, can you see this all right?
Yes,
Yeah.
I can.
Perfect. Okay. And just click play here, Kathie.
Yes, please.
Perfect.
All rise.
All righty. Kathie, you should be able to share your screen now again.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I apologize for that.
No.
Okay. So looking over definitions, this is, in just a moment, comment about that. The music I think was a little bit cheesy in the background, but the message I think was clear that this is a form of non-conscious bias, implicit bias that is used regularly, particularly with people of color or people who have disabilities or age or et cetera, et cetera.
Kathie, so sorry. I think you're going to have to reshare your screen again down at the bottom of the Zoom window. There's the share screen so that we can see the PowerPoint again.
All right. This is fun. Is everybody having a good time? Eek! All right.
No, that's great. And then you'll just want to go up to the slideshow and do the, yep, perfect.
Okay. So we got to get back here a ways somehow. Okay, let's go way back up here. All right. So the best definition that I could come up, thank you for your patience, everyone, is that unintended discrimination or unintended consequences are lead to ethnic, socioeconomic, and other inequalities. Okay, I'm going to hide that participant. Okay. Now I'm going to move right into basically the meat of the matter, and that is the cognitive process. Is our brains work in a specific way? We were built that way. I mean, way, way, way back. We're built that way as a matter of survival, so that we could immediately recognize if there was, if we needed to use our fight or our flight side of our brain. And if we had learned experience of what, for example, a neighboring community, what their appearance was. And then we would know that if they were a community that we couldn't get along with, then we better prepare ourselves. And if it was, then everything was safe. So that process has remained the same, since there's been no evolutionary reason to make that change in our brains at all. So our brains work the same. It's a normal brain process. It's the way we take in information and make sense of things. And our brains work kind of like a filing cabinet, where we take information in. And here's the thing, the information does not have to be valid information. We can probably see that right now with COVID, the COVID response. People have different ideas about things based on the information and many other things that we will talk about. And that's, we just go automatically back into that filing cabinet when we see someone, anyone, and we pull out the things. Like we said, it's automatic, it's quick, it's immediate, and then we apply them. So if, for example, at some point, you know, we learned what this pen did, right? And we probably all on the call know what it does now. But we do very similar thing with people. We have learned what this does. We put it in our little filing cabinet brain up here. And if we're in a Zoom meeting, or if we are on the phone and we need to jot down a note, we don't have to stop and think about how we're ever going to do that. We can simply see this out of the corner of our eye. It's an automatic thing. And we do very much the same with people. That automation piece, though, is what shapes the conscious thought and guides our judgment and decision making. But because of the way that cognitive process works, implicit bias happens if we intend it to or not. And a good example of that is Anthony Greenwald was the original designer of an implicit association test. And in that test, he showed pictures of flowers and pictures of insects, making the assumption that people liked flowers and that people didn't really like insects, general population, not entomologists themselves. But what he asked to have done then is the participants would associate the words that came up on the screen. They would associate pleasant sounding words, pleasant words, with the flowers, and they would associate non-pleasant words with the insects. And then he switched it around. And so now the participants were asked to associate pleasant words with the insects and non-pleasant words with the flowers. And there was definitely a lag between the automaticity of the original one, where they identified flowers with positive language, and this one, because people had to actually stop and think about it. They could not get into that filing cabinet of theirs and make sense of it. So Dr. Greenwald moved on, and he wanted to see how that impacted, if that same principle led over to human beings. And so he came up with several European American sounding names and several African American sounding names, and he put those on the screen and then asked the participants to associate each of those, first the excuse me, the African American sounding name with pleasant language, and the European sounding name with unpleasant language. And then he asked them to switch. And the result of that was that when people were asked to associate the pleasant sounding word with the European American name, it was almost automatic. That's another example of non-conscious bias. When they were asked to associate a pleasant name with an African American sounding name, a pleasant word with the African American sounding name, that took a lot longer, and people had to really stop and think about it. And Dr. Greenwald said that he experienced that himself as he was doing this and was very disappointed. He realized he had biases, but nothing like this. I took the implicit association test that Harvard offers online for free, and I've got a link to that later in this presentation. But it measured the level of my own biases on race, on age, and on gender. And I did really poorly on the one on gender. In fact, I have many negative biases toward my own gender. And that made total sense to me. I wasn't happy with it, but it made sense to me as I learned more about why that works that way. So our brains take in information. Again, it doesn't have to be accurate information. And we develop these shortcuts so that we can automatically file them away in our brains. And if you stop and think that they do it in 4 different ways: social categorization, in-group preferencing, stereotyping, and attribution bias. And I'll talk about each one of those shortly. The first thing in the filing cabinet, if you looked at that brain and saw, you'd see 2 sections, and they're master status categories. We judge people based on race and ethnicity and gender. So I don't know if anybody on this call is familiar with the old Saturday Night Live show that at one point had a little clip about a person called Pat. And Pat was an androgynous appearing person. And the whole point of this little, few minutes of funniness was that people continued to try to make Pat trip up so that Pat would give them some hint or some indication if Pat was a male or a female. We currently are looking more at gender fluidity, but the fact of the matter is that because of our, and I think it will eventually change because evolutionarily we're going to have to get there, but it's not that way now. And I know that I have experienced this myself, and maybe some of you have too, when going to a restaurant or someplace and you are offered assistance by one of the clerks there or the waiter or waitress, and you cannot tell right away if that person is a male or a female. And so that is kind of like a bump in the cognitive process, because you're not able to get back into that filing cabinet that's going to tell you how you interact with this person if this person is a male, or interact with this person if this person is a female. In-group preferencing is the second thing that we automatically do, and it's just kind of like junior high again. We've got in-group and we've got members of the out-group, and it's whom we've been culturally taught to consider as in-group members. And then that is exacerbated by socialization and continued exposure to media. If we think back on the Constitution of this country and how that was started and by whom, the by whom was, a bunch of old white guys who were very wealthy landowners, and most of them had slaves. So when they talked about all men are created equal, they didn't mean all people were created equal. They meant all white men who were very wealthy were equal. And so that has caused definitely some issues, and certainly institutionalized and systematized discrimination. But if we look back historically, culturally in the United States, it was in 1870 that African Americans got the right to vote. But it wasn't until 45 that, excuse me, I'm kind of forgetting my dates here, that African Americans actually, the Voting Rights Act was passed, and African Americans did actually have the right to vote. Then in 2013, the Supreme Court decided to gut that bill or that law, and essentially it's pretty much useless. And Congress has fairly recently passed, a couple of years ago actually, a new Voting Rights Act, but it's not been passed through the Senate yet. And we're seeing the outcome of that. We saw the outcome of that as states started to make up their own rules and regulations through this last round of voting. And now with the runoff in Georgia that's going to happen in January, the state legislature has determined that they're no longer going to allow mail-in votes, and they're drastically reducing the number of places that people can vote. So voting suppression is healthy again, once again. When I talk about socialization, I'm talking about the lessons that we learned, and they weren't specific, like you're a little girl, so this is how you're going to be treated, or you're a little boy. If any of you have a sibling who is an opposite gender of you, you probably can remember back how not only your parents treated you both, but how society treated you both. And it was probably very differently than dependent on gender. One of my daughters had the desire to be a boy, and it started about the time she was 3 years old until she was about in 4th grade. She had a little boy's name. She had the swagger. I didn't even realize little boys had a swagger until I saw her adopt it, and it looked normal. And all the little boys thought that she was a boy, and so she played with them. She was on their sports team. She called herself Doug. She wore a backwards hat. When I noticed adults interacting with her, though, and when they first thought that she was a boy, they treated her equally along with the other boys. As soon as they learned that she was not a boy and she was a girl, then their voices got softer when they spoke with her. She kind of got excluded physically from that group, and other things were quite clear about the socialization process. And we take all of that in and use that to form information, real or not, about people. Continued exposure to media, I think, is an incredibly big part of this. We see over 6,000 to 10,000 ads per day on average. And those ads tell us so much about how we're supposed to think, what we're supposed to value. We value youth over age. We value ability over people who have disabilities. We value thin over heavy. We value white over people of color. Now that is changing with a lot of work and the Me Too movement and all of the horrific things that have happened forever, but more attention has been provided to them recently. I was in Taiwan visiting my daughter who worked there for a few years, and a delightful gentleman picked me up at the airport, and he was so eager to use his English. So we had a nice long conversation, and he talked a lot about Obama, had a lot of questions about him. And then he asked me if he could ask a specific question. And I said, of course. And he asked if I knew any Black people. And I asked him why he wanted to know that. And he said, well, because I want to know if all Black people are bad. And that was just like heart-stopping to me. And I questioned him and said, why would you think that? And he said, well, I watch a lot of American television and a lot of American television shows, and all the Black people on there are bad. And I just wanted to know if they really are or not. And so we had a really good open conversation about that. And I think I convinced him that no, that was not accurate, but that media certainly hammered that home, unfortunately. What we do then is we unconsciously simplify the categorizations by exaggerating the differences between people and minimizing the differences within those groups. And in-group preferencing ends up being one of the primary causes of unequal treatment. Stereotyping is something that we're probably all pretty familiar with, or at least familiar with the word. Stereotyping tells us how people are, and it even tells us how they're supposed to be. And we tend to pursue and remember the information, whether it's valid information or not, that supports those expectations. So my daughter, gosh, they were just this little scientific lab for me. But she was teaching anthropology to a big classroom, to a lecture hall. And she'd already arranged this, and maybe some of you have actually heard of this experiment, but she wanted to try it out in the classroom. And so she took her bag and she put it on the floor. And she was a few minutes into her lecture, and the door broke open, and somebody dressed in a black hoodie and black slacks ran in, grabbed her purse, and ran out. So she called the campus police, who came immediately. They were in on the deal. And they interviewed students to see if they could remember and give them a full description of what this individual looked like. And with almost every interview that they did with these students, the students said it was a Black male who came in and stole my daughter's purse. A few minutes later, the actual perpetrator came in, and she unhooded herself, and she was a very petite, blonde female. But these are the kinds of things based on a number of things: the hood, the Black clothing, the messages that have been sent, where people made the assumption that this was a Black male who stole my daughter's purse. Okay. How does this impact addiction and people who have addiction to alcohol and drugs? Well, it has an incredible impact. We know from the research that's been done that people with addictions, drug and alcohol addictions, are regular folks. They're parents, they're kids, they're our colleagues, they're our aunts and uncles who hold full-time jobs and get to work on time and have good, strong friendships. But society, and I'm going to argue mostly because of the media that we see and what media is telling us about people who have addictions, unless of course you're a very famous person and then you get the buy for that. But people are seen in these ways that I don't even want to say out loud. But the issue with these stereotypes is that they lead to diminished assistance that people who have drug and alcohol addiction desperately need. And those individuals are treated as less than humans. And so the likelihood of them getting the assistance that they need is diminished because of that. But also the individuals who are struggling are less likely to go for assistance because they know that they will be treated less than. They know how that feels. Okay, the last thing that we do, our brain does, to differentiate and go into that filing cabinet is something called attribution bias. And it's the prejudice that's based on the attributes, the characteristics, or the qualities that we associate with people. So when those actions conform, we say it's ability, or, yay, everything's right with the world. When those actions are inconsistent, then we ignore those actions or we make excuses for those actions. So let's go back into the grocery store example. And if you had 10 women in front of you, assuming that you made the assumption that this particular woman paid with food stamps or SNAP, and 9 of those 10 women before the last one went and paid with some other method of payment, either cash or a check or a debit credit card or something like that. And that 10th woman paid with SNAP. You'd be watching for it because you were so sure, and your non-conscious mind wanted to be sure and grab that information that would strengthen your biases that were already there. That's the one that your brain would remember. You would either have ignored or made excuses for, if you noticed at all, the other women and their methods of payment. If we looked at the male and we had 10 men standing in line, and the man that I described who had the nice coat and or jacket and tie, and 9 of those 10 men paid with SNAP, and the 10th man paid with some other form of payment, that's the one we would remember, because that too is consistent with what our expectations were of that person based on all of these things we've just talked about. And if we had, in fact, which I don't think we would generally have noticed, that they would have paid, these gentlemen would have paid with SNAP, we would have either ignored it. If we saw it, we didn't pay any attention to it, or we would have made excuses for that person doing that. Like, maybe his wife just died and he is desperate for money, and so on and so forth. So it's a real issue if you stop and think about that and how that can impact. I had a friend who had applied for a job, she was in a clerical type job. I am so sorry that my dog is barking. But she wanted to move up in management. And so she talked to her supervisor and asked, because she knew some positions were coming open in their future. And she wanted to know how she could have a good, strong application and what she could do in the meantime in the next couple of months. And he suggested to her she do various things, that she really take on extra work, that she stay late and finish that work, that she, take some risks and get up in staff meeting and talk about the work she was doing, and several other ideas. She applied for the job. She was not selected. She wasn't terribly surprised about that because it was her first try at getting into management. So she went back into her supervisor and said, okay, I didn't get the job. I know that John did. And can you tell me what the difference was in our applications, how I can strengthen my application in the next time, because I think I'd be really good in management. And he said, well, let me think about that for a minute. You should probably talk to John and ask him, because what I saw was that he was taking on extra assignments. He was staying late. He was taking risks and talking in staff meetings and talking about the kinds of things he was doing. Those were exactly the things she was doing, but that was not consistent with what he saw as her as a female. And so it was ignored, or he just made excuses for it, but it didn't have any value like the males did. So in that example, members of the in-group have expectations that they will succeed, and members who are in the out-group, which in our society is the in-group are white males, and out-group are everybody other than white males, people of color and women. And the out-group is expected to fail, and the interpretation of that, not the behavior, is the thing that becomes a cognitive fact. So there was another, I guess, example that is really powerful, I think, is recent, and maybe some of you have heard of this, but there was a recent study done, and the intention was to find out if applicants for particular jobs were treated equally. And so a man sat down and he made several applications up, one with a European American sounding name, assigned to it. And it's outstanding application, outstanding references, outstanding experience. And then he made the same application up using people who had an African American sounding name, Hispanic sounding name, Native American sounding name, and sent all of those in. And he waited to hear from any employer who might be interested in interviewing anyone who did not have a European American sounding name. He, as the European American who did it, got many outreach calls about asking him to come in and interview for the position. But this is the thing, the people who were doing the interviewing, the people who were doing the hiring had full expectations non-consciously about the European American sounding name probably being a white person. And so the expectations were that this male was going to succeed in the assignment that they would get. Whereas members of the out group, again, not consciously, they were expected to fail because of the associations that this particular person that doing the hiring had based around their implicit biases. When we look at the long term and we take, here's how systematic racism or systematized racism happens. We start with individual biases. So if we go back to our founding fathers, and their biases were definitely toward white men who were wealthy and owned land and probably at that time owned slaves. Individual biases then turns into an institutionalization that pulls together those collective practices and decisions and policies that then leads to systemic racism. Okay, so we talked about a bunch of stuff here already. We've talked about the different ways the cognitive process works and the things that, you know, the activities that we do in order to ensure that we hold on to those implicit biases. And again, we have not had any major things that have happened that would cause our brain patterns to change or our filing cabinets to change. So there's been a lot of attention given to how do we minimize implicit bias. And there was I don't know how, you know, the experiences of everybody on this in this Zoom call are, but I had been and have been, you know, trained in diversity a number of times. And what the training looked like when I was forced to go through it was about all the differences of anybody who wasn't white, the cultures, the people, et cetera, et cetera. And what that type of training actually ended up doing was to just solidify those implicit biases that we already had. It was just more information that you could take and say, oh yeah, I know, I'm right about this. The other thing, so that there, I hope that there's not much diversity training going on anymore, but at any rate, the other thing that it works a little bit, but it's not long-term, so I put it here under the not work, is to, because when I originally did this research a number of years ago, one of the things that was suggested was to prominently display counter stereotypical pictures and images of people. So maybe there would be a Black female doctor, a picture of a Black female doctor taking care of a white elderly female or something like that. What this specific thing does is very similar to that. So you've got these non-stereotypic images of maybe of Latina engineers or something. But in this instance, if you put a really repulsive picture of a white person up there, in this case, maybe Charlie Manson, and you've got that up there, and you've got the non-stereotype image of the Latina that I just mentioned, then people will look at both of those and they'll think, Charlie Manson is terrifying and he's a bad person. And then they will look at the picture, the non-stereotypical picture that they're seeing of this Latina engineer, and they have good thoughts about that. That lasts just for a little bit, you know, not more than a month or so, because we go back to our implicit biases and we forget all about that. It's kind of like shock therapy that may or may not work for a little bit. The things that show promise are things like this awareness training today, training in implicit bias so that people can understand where it comes from, how it's made, how we hold on to it, and how it influences our decisions and everything else. You can take that test at this link, and if you don't have time to write it down or something, I can certainly come back to this page. Or you can just Google for it. It doesn't cost anything to take the test. They use it for research. Excuse me, the information for research. But I'm not crazy enough or delusional enough to think that awareness training alone or training on implicit bias is going to have long-term impact, because it doesn't change the system. I did so much training in this when I worked with USDA and with the nonprofit organization. And honestly, when I first started the training and I learned about it in a social psychology class at the University of Nebraska, I thought, wow, this is the thing. This is the magic bullet that is going to change the world. And what happened is I gave it, as I said, numerous amounts of time, and I got to a place that I really wanted to know if that training was having any impact. So I went back a couple of years and randomly sampled people who attended that training and tried to find out, if they still held any beliefs or any information that they learned from that training. Pleasantly, I was surprised that of the people who responded, and there was a pretty low response rate, frankly, but of the people who responded, over 50% of the people did remember at least one little nugget, and they did give examples of how they noticed their implicit biases, which I thought was encouraging. But again, that's not creating any mass action toward, destroying systemic racism. The other thing that I think has a lot of promise, but it's difficult to achieve, is something called intergroup contact. And intergroup contact is creating a table of people that has some kind of authority among them. And so people come to the table, a diverse group of people, age, gender, race, ethnicity, and have conversations about whatever it is whatever issue that they're tackling. We did a lot of this kind of work when I was working for the nonprofit Center for Rural Affairs in our community work, because traditionally in small towns across Nebraska and most other states, it's old white guys who are running that community. And so we tried to show change in how that happened. And the thing is with intergroup contact, that it has to last a long period of time for people to really get to know each other and see beyond their implicit biases and see each other as people. And it can work. I ran a national mentoring program for USDA about 10 years ago. And this was something that USDA had pretty much committed to, was addressing the non-diversity that they had in their workforce, and particularly in leadership positions. And so they wanted us to put together a program, a mentoring program. So this mentor program gathered proteges who were either people of color or women as the proteges, the trainees. And then the mentors were, successful leaders within the USDA that had been around for a long time. So AKA old white men. And there was one woman, I think, in that group. But nobody, it was like the draw. Nobody knew how we were going to make these pairings. Nobody knew who was in the program as far as the mentor or the protege. And a friend of mine grew up in a small town in Iowa, which is the same town that the guy who developed the eHarmony thing grew up. And so she went to him, because we kind of wanted to keep this like a blind audition. And so she went to him and asked him if he could create some kind of a compatibility test that people could take so we could pair the mentor with the protege. And he did, and it worked wonderfully. The people had the same values and they saw the world very similarly, and so they clicked. And interestingly, my favorite part of that, and this mentor program went on for about 1.5 years, so they had lots of time to spend together and get to know each other, and clear across the country. They'd never met each other. But the interesting part to me was when I interviewed people at the end of that mentor program, I learned from both the mentors and the proteges alike that one of their very biggest takeaways was they never would have picked that person to be either their mentor or their protege, because they would never have thought that they had anything in common. And now they were absolutely best of friends and, had such high respect and regard for each other. So that brings me to the almost last page of this. And that is the things that are most promising. Dr. Greenwald, who was I talked about him very early on, developing the first implicit association test, recently published in, I think it's in the references, I think it's the annual review of psychology or annual journal of psychology. And he recently posted in there this year that he's finding that data collection that documents and identifies what the problem is very is showing promise in terms of minimizing implicit bias. But you can't just leave it at that. You can't just collect that information and then put it away on a shelf somewhere. It actually has to be acted upon. There has to be accountability built into it. There have to be, guidelines to be used. And one of the things that he was strongly proposing, and I think holds a lot of promise, is that we are required to make decisions, hirings, promotions, so on and so forth, without using our discretion. So we cannot use those predetermined, we have to use, predetermined objective criteria. We aren't able, because we're not allowed to use any discretion. So that means that we can't go back into our filing cabinet and pull out and apply what we have in there. There was a symphony in the 1970s. I don't know what symphony it was, but they weren't stellar. They were okay. And the local women were really pushing them because about 10% of the symphony was made up of women and the rest were all men. And so they pushed and came and suggested strongly that what they start to do is hold these blind auditions, and behind a curtain, people would come and play their instrument, and it's kind of like, what is it, The Voice on television now? So it was very much like that, but they didn't see the person. They couldn't make any kind of association. All they heard was the music, and they could decide without their own discretion of what music sounded the very best or who played the instrument the best. And so that symphony went from a little under 10% women to about 40% women, and played much better music too, I might add. The accountability piece is really important. Gathering information, if we go back up to this first bullet point, finding out from everyone who is in your office, if you're going to work in an office situation, anonymously, let people share their information anonymously about, are they feeling welcome in this office environment? Do they feel, are they seeing any microaggressions or any exclusions or things like that? And then build a program around that and hold people accountable. People held their symphony accountable. We need to do the same for our institutions and for our elected officials and for ourselves. So that wraps up the presentation. Here's my list of references if you're interested in that at all. And if anybody has questions, I'm happy to take a stab at answering them.